Hi, Lant. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
Great to be back in India.
You're the first person I've had here who grew up in a rich country. When did you first notice that growth is important?
When I was 19, I went as a Mormon missionary to Argentina. And Argentina in 1978 was in the middle of a pretty severe episode of inflation. And I had always been interested in economics and always been predisposed to believing that economic activity was important. By being in a foreign country, seeing other people's livelihoods, and in particular how fragile those were with respect to the macroeconomy. I was actually working at the World Bank in the research department, and I was working on social issues. And one of the things was child mortality and what are the cross-national determinants of child mortality. And I knew that GDP was important. I had no idea how important it really was. What explains whether countries have high or low child mortality? If you ask the data said GDP matters, women's education matters, and those two factors alone explain 95% of the variance. In the US, growth has been largely concentrated among the rich. The growth incidence curve is very steep. That influences discussions around the world, including in places like Chile, where the opposite's been true. The growth incidence curve has been really pro-poor, and yet the political discourse in Chile is dominated by discussions of rising inequality. If you create in yourself the belief that, Indians, they don't really aspire to the lifestyle of Americans or Danes or Japanese, they could be happy with less, then growth isn't necessary.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Fed Dialogues. I'm particularly excited today because we have with us Lant Pritchett, who is one of the leading voices in the world about the importance of economic growth. And for me personally, I have discovered that no matter which field I go to, Lant is always the most sensible voice. When I was studying governance, Lant's book on building state capability was the best thing that I could find. When I was working in education, his book, Schooling Ain't Learning, was the best book. And now when I'm working in the field of economic growth, Lant is the number one voice here. So very excited to have him. Hi, Lant. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
Great to be back in India.
Excellent. Okay, so this has become a little bit of a tradition now when I start asking people with, what is your personal connection to economic growth? How did you first figure out that growth is important? Usually, for Indian folks, there's a lot of 1991. We saw it pre and post. But you're the first person I've had here who grew up in a rich country. When did you first notice that growth is important?
So I grew up in the West of the United States where, things are pretty prosperous and always have been, or during my lifetime. But when I was 19, I went as a Mormon missionary to Argentina. And Argentina in 1978 was in the middle of a pretty severe episode of inflation. And I had always been interested in economics and always been predisposed to believing that economic activity was important. But I think by being in a foreign country, seeing other people's livelihoods, and in particular how fragile those were with respect to the macroeconomy, because no matter how prudent you were being personally, with inflation of 150%, your wages could deteriorate in a matter of weeks. And so just a huge amount of time and effort was devoted to essentially economizing against the risk of inflation. So, workers would, get paid and go straight to the store. And so I do think that highlighted that not just growth, but stability and kind of having reliable incomes was just super important to people in a way that, again, having grown up in a situation where my father always had a pretty good job and et cetera, was hard to realize. And then I think professionally, I'd always, been disposed to believe growth important, but professionally, I started working on I was actually working at the World Bank in the research department, and I was working on social issues. And one of the things was child mortality and what are the cross-national determinants of child mortality. And I knew that GDP was important. I had no idea how important it really was. So we were sort of writing this paper about the relative importance of government spending versus GDP on child mortality. And we came to the conclusion that it was literally all GDP.
Right.
Like if you said, what explains whether countries have high or low child mortality? If you asked the data said GDP matters, women's education matters, and those two factors alone explain 95% of the variance. Yeah. Like if you tell me GDP and women's education, I can tell you child mortality to within a very narrow range. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden my mindset shifted from the question isn't particularly for basic indicators, like child mortality, not so much in the luxury end, but really basics. The question isn't, is economic growth important? The question is economic growth all that's important?
So you already touched on a bunch of different themes that I want to cover.
Okay.
Right? But I'll take them in reverse order almost, right? I want to touch fragility in Argentina. I want to touch how important different things are. But starting with this last thing you said, right? Is like, what is the thing that convinces you the most that growth is the biggest and the most important thing that we should be focused on?
My answer is almost the opposite. The answer is, how could it be otherwise? Because I find people in this very odd position when they argue against growth, is they say, here are these things that are really important to people. Adequate nutrition, shelter that's decent, clothes that they can wear in public, education for their children. And these are super important to them, but somehow if they have more money, well, they won't get more of them. I just don't get that. Like, how you can take the view that economic growth isn't important seems the odd thing to me, because, it's almost if, I really care about shelter, how can you not care about growth? Because if you really believe this is important to people, then why wouldn't they, right, if they had expanded resources? So if by economic growth you mean the purchasing power that households deploy to meet their wants, wishes, needs, and aspirations, if you're claiming something super important, you have to believe economic growth is important. It's almost this, it's this weird mindset. I find it almost a weird mindset to believe the opposite. So if you ask me, why do I think growth is so important? It's like, no. The question should be, how can you go around saying, I really care that people have adequate shelter, but I don't really think economic growth is important to that? It's like, then what are people doing? You have to assume that people really aren't adequate, stewards of their own well-being to imagine that they're having more money in their pocket but won't make a significant difference to things they care about.
Sure. So let me put it slightly differently. Right?
Okay.
I think you're one of the few voices out there right now really making this case that you just pointed out, right?
Right.
So when you do come across people who believe this, right? That look, it's nutrition that is important, that's health that's important, but economic growth is not what they care.
Yeah.
What are the arguments?
Yeah.
And what is the evidence that you have found to be the most powerful? Because and I know from you, in fact, that these two things are not necessarily the same, right? So, evidence doesn't necessarily convince people.
So I think there are two well, okay. Now this is going to be a relatively long answer.
Please.
There's three sort of things you could believe, right? One, you could believe that the distribution of the growth you're seeing is so incredibly weighted to the very rich that if I have, and I'm an economist, so I'm going to draw pictures with my hands in the air, but you could say, well, I care about income going to people that are poor, and my concern about the gains to growth get lower the richer people are. That's a perfectly reasonable view. And I believe that if I think about the growth incidence, who's benefiting, some people believe that all of the growth is happening to the very rich.
Yeah.
That's a persuasive, if that were true, it would be a persuasive argument against economic growth being a priority.
Right.
I think on that, I just think people are misled in a couple of ways. They hear about the growth at the top being big in absolute terms.
The rich getting richer and the poor staying poor
Yeah.
or getting poor.
And half of that's true. The rich are getting richer,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean the poor are getting poorer.
Right.
So if you look at we have now over time really good data on the distribution of income, and hence we can look at the evolution and what we call growth incidence curves. How much did the 10th percentile grow, and how much did the 40th percentile grow, and how much growth was at the top? And so even if the top are growing more, it doesn't mean the poor are growing less. It's not a fixed size pie. That's the whole point, is it's expanding. So, and I do think there's a sense to which the US experience inadvertently and maybe subconsciously affects people's view of the whole world, because a lot of the media are centered in the US, a lot of academics, even from India, are based in the US. And in the US, growth has been largely concentrated among the rich. The growth incidence curve is very steep. But, that influences discussions around the world, including in places like Chile, where the opposite's been true. The growth incidence curve has been really pro-poor,
Right.
and yet the political discourse in Chile is dominated by discussions of rising inequality, even though, and I have a close friend who, is Chilean, works on the Chilean economy. Chile has experienced the largest reduction in inequality maybe ever experienced, and yet the political discourse gets dominated by ideas that the rich are getting richer. So I think it's easy to make confusion between absolute and relative.
Right.
Because if the poor grow 5% and the rich grow 5%,
Yeah.
5% of a big number is much bigger than 5% of a small number.
Yeah.
So if you look around at Maseratis and Lamborghinis and, apartments in Mumbai, you can say, look at the rich, they're absolutely gaining a ton. That's true.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that proportionately other people aren't gaining so much. So I think that's a first confusion, is that I think people generally are just factually wrong about the incidence of growth and believe it's much more pro-rich than it really is.
And growth has been very much, the incidence has fallen on the poor as well, right? And this idea that it is not is just wrong.
No, in India, and again, the data is weak and there are serious problems, but the existing data suggests that actually the proportionate terms, the poor deciles grew faster than the middle class.
Yeah.
And so it's not a growth curve that looks like this.
Yeah.
It's a growth curve that kind of looks like this.
Yeah.
So
And,
anyway,
and all social groups as well. It's not just
So
quite often in India the question of caste and religion comes up. But yeah.
No,
okay, that's one.
And in India, I think, I've done some research with Dalit researchers on Dalits.
That's a fantastic paper.
In Uttar Pradesh, and they actually benefited in some ways more. And we can go into the details of the Indian experience. But I think, in general, opponents of growth are sometimes opponents of growth because they have beliefs about growth being concentrated among the rich that are just empirically false.
Yeah.
And it's easy to maintain those beliefs because the media is constantly telling you that inequality is the issue you should be worried about, and look at all these billionaires, and so it's easy to have factually incorrect views. And Hans Rosling has a famous book called Factfulness, where he shows that people don't tend to have correct factual views about the evolution of things. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing is that you could believe that there are effective collective action that would raise well-being by a lot,
Right.
and that doing that is priority. And then you could have the belief that when an economist like me says growth is also important for child mortality or also important from shelter, I mean to the exclusion of doing those things.
So just to again make it simpler, you're saying that there could be government programs or charity programs that could raise the well-being of people a lot better than growth, right?
Better than growth, absolutely. In a more, better than growth.
Or at least
better than growth in the sense of cost effectiveness.
Right. Sure.
You could say, why would we have growth to improve child mortality when we know vaccinations work? Absolutely. No one, and I think there's this, and again, I'm trying to explain the mindset of people who oppose growth, is that if you believe that an economist like me says that instrumentally, in order to achieve growth, we have to cut all government programs, including cost-effective programs for child health, then you could say, well, screw that, let's do the cost-effective things as child growth, even if it costs us growth. But no responsible economist is saying that. We are saying things like you should worry about macro prudence because you can generate inflation or crises through imprudent fiscal policy, but I have never been in a country, and I've worked on lots of countries that head into fiscal crises and other things. I've never met a country where the fiscal crisis was caused by doing cost-effective things that really benefited the poor. That's not what breaks the budget, right? If you look around at what breaks the budget, it's usually crazy subsidies to industry or huge programs that benefit mainly the middle class. So it's like, the belief that we need fiscal prudence and the belief we should do cost-effective things for the poor are not incompatible beliefs. But if you believed they were, then I could understand why you would say, if I'm forced to choose between growth and vaccinations, I choose vaccinations. And it's like, so would I. But that's a crazy thing. That's not the real choice, right? At the margin, we don't need to cut vaccinations to achieve fiscal prudence of the type that's necessary to create stable expectations to great growth.
So that's false dichotomy.
I think there's so I think the conflict is not about growth itself. It's about, they assume that if you're promoting growth, you have specific causal beliefs about what caused the growth that are incompatible with effective collective action, and that's, again, just not true.
Right. So that's a false dichotomy, but there are lots of damaging things that you can do in the name of welfare. Right?
Lots of damaging things you can do what?
In the name of welfare, right? In the name of welfare.
Oh, no. I think, so again, we could have a debate whether, there are lots of things that are done that are inefficient and not cost effective in the name of welfare.
Fuel subsidies, for instance.
Fuel subsidies, for instance, right? And again, often the benefit to the poor is after a rhetorical cover of things that massively benefit, the middle class.
Yeah.
So, one of my career assignments was, for a couple of years, I was the World Bank person assisting the Indonesian government in create safety net programs to protect people from the consequences of the East Asia crisis. So we had, the World Bank was subsidizing rice. And then after the crisis subsided, there was this truly bizarre conversation where the government cut all of the safety net programs, but continued the fuel subsidy on the premise that, the fuel subsidy benefits the poor. And it was just demonstrably untrue. I mean, our programs weren't, meaning the programs that the Indonesian government and the World Bank and others had financed to address the crisis, they weren't perfectly targeted towards the poor, but they were 5 times more targeted towards the poor in terms of benefit incidence than was the fuel subsidy. Yeah. And yet, since the fuel subsidy benefited the middle class and benefited the poor a little bit, then the rhetoric was, we can't cut the fuel subsidy because it would hurt the poor, which was just rhetorical charade. So again, I'm not saying, I want to be clear. I'm not saying in order to promote growth, we have to cut cost-effective social programs and there's some deep trade-off between growth and effective collective action to address problems. Absolutely not, right? Every modern economist understands the needs and wants for government intervention in a variety of ways, and those are an integral part of growth in some ways. So it's not like if you're in favor of economic growth, you are necessarily laissez-faire and government has to be, small night watchman state. That's a range of views, but it's not a necessary view that if you're in favor of growth, you're in favor of that particular narrative of the causality of growth. And at the same time, you don't, if I go back to this research we were doing about, the determinants of child mortality, we wrote a paper that tried to highlight the paradox that if you look at the data on child mortality, if you look at the programmatic data, there are things that just are demonstrably, amazingly cost effective. So, the cost per child life saved in expectation is just a few $100s. Right. And yet if you look at the macro data, it suggests that government spending on average has almost no impact on child mortality. Right. And if you calculate what's spent per child death averted, it appears to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So again, whatever we spend, we want to spend effectively, whether that affects growth or not.
Right.
So again,
which is something, again, very rare.
Exactly.
For government to do.
It's look, let's talk about what's effective and cost effective to do in order to promote, better education, better health, and we can have that conversation independently in some sense of its impact on growth. And we can have the conversation about what would promote growth in some sense independently of doing the things that are cost-effective public action that raise well-being, because those are almost never the real causes of fiscal crises and macro instability.
Fair. So this is leg 2. What's the third aspect of the answer?
Yeah. So the third thing is, and this is especially true in the West today, and saying this in these brutal terms is going to get me in trouble, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think a fair number of people in the West follow the following train of thought. The following train of thought is, and literally 3 days ago I saw a graph put out by some group called the Visual Capitalist that said, how many planets would it take to sustain people at the lifestyle of various countries? The US lifestyle for everyone in the world to have it would take 5 Earths.
But that's demonstrably untrue.
Anyway, just bracket this for a second.
Sure.
You're asking me a hard question, which is why do other people think I'm wrong? Sure. It's that seems an unreasonable view to me, but I'm trying to be most as sympathetic as I can. So, and this is not very sympathetic, but so there's a group of people that have always had the mindset that total output in the world can at most be X because of constraint Y. Yeah. So land is scarce, water is scarce, the the carbon absorption capability of the atmosphere without warming is scarce, whatever. And it goes back to Malthus, right? Since Malthus, there's been a group that says, look, the maximum output we can have is X because of limiting factor Y, therefore the output per person is X divided by people, and that is a fifth of what the US now does. Okay. You could believe that. I think it's wrong, but you could believe that.
Sure.
Then your conclusion would be, there is no political scenario in which the US cuts its consumption to a fifth of its current level.
Right.
So, our only hope of not hitting these limits and destroying whatever it is that poor countries stay poor.
Right.
Okay. So, total output's limited. Rich countries are well beyond that. Therefore, poor countries have to stay poor. At which point, they nearly all realize, I'm a heartless shit to believe that. I'm just a terrible person if I believe that the solution to the world's problems is, because in this graph, by the way, India is at 0.7 of Earth. Yeah. So everyone could have India's lifestyle and on the Earth that we have.
Yeah.
But again, you quickly realize, I'm a heartless shit to therefore believe that Indians should somehow, because the US and other countries have used up the natural abundance of the earth to get their wealth, Indians should bear the cost for that. And again, no one really doesn't immediately realize that asking the poor countries to stay poor, if you believed that the poor countries to stay poor would condemn them to a low standard of living, you're a heartless shit. But if you create in yourself the belief that, oh, Indians, they don't really aspire to the lifestyle of Americans or Danes or Japanese. They're happy with, they could be happy with less.
Then growth is not
we could, we could, then growth isn't necessary.
Right.
So you have a really, if you believe these things about Malthusianism, you have a super high stakes incentive to personally believe that people can achieve standards of living at very low levels of income and growth isn't necessary, because since we can't have it, we don't, the basic logic is since we can't have it, we don't need it, right? Yeah. And since nearly 100% of the people who believe we can't have it live in countries and have lifestyles that are dramatically high. I have literally never met a person arguing the world can't sustain itself who is living in an Indian middle-class lifestyle.
Right.
They just don't. So anyway, so I think this is a powerful motivator for anti-growth beliefs, is wanting to believe that, if you really, really, really believe there's limits, and you really, really, really are even moderately sensible about what's politically possible, which, a recession in the U.S. that cuts GDP by 2% causes enormous political backlash and repercussions. The idea that the U.S. is going to significantly cut its lifestyle is just ludicrous. And then you end up in this thing of, if I believe the world's limited, I know I can't cut rich country GDP, poor countries have to get poor. The only way I can reconcile that internally is to believe poor countries don't need to grow in order to have a decent lifestyle.
Right.
And it's just false. Right. It's just false.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so these are the main three arguments.
I think those are three main arguments, yeah. And all of them I can see people believing them, even though I believe they're false.
Right. And so that's the argument. What about the evidence? Now, you're the person who's been putting together the most research, the most data on just how important growth is, right?
Yeah.
So can you just quickly sketch out take as long as you want, actually, right? Just sketch out what is the most powerful set of facts and evidence and data that you've put together that really convinces you that growth is very important.
So I'm a very visual person. I'm a very empirical person, but also a very visual person.
We'll put up the relevant graph in the video. So if you can just refer to it.
So I think I developed these envelopment graphs. Right. And usually when economists and statisticians present associations, they then present standard errors. It's like, well, if you're at this level of income, this is the range in which we would expect to see your standard of living.
Yeah.
But kind of that's sample-based. But with countries, it's not a sample.
That's the population.
It's the universe. We have roughly all of the countries in the world. So rather than presenting standard error bounds, I present graphs that all of the combinations of GDP and basics fall in this range, or all of the combinations of poverty and median consumption fall in this range.
Right.
And to some extent, the narrower that range, the less plausible it is that you're going to move significantly outside of it, because in all the experiences of the 150 countries in the world, we've never seen a country do that. So the odds you're going to do that are small. Yeah. So I think these data envelopment graphs are very powerful because it sort of says, look, no country has ever achieved, less than, we can create the calculations of the following type. No country with your income or lower has ever achieved poverty lower than this.
Right.
So if you want to achieve poverty lower than this, you need to move, the distribution, you need to have economic growth. And then I think this helps us distinguish between visionaries and fantasists.
Right.
A visionary would look at a data development graph and say, as countries move, to higher median consumption, their poverty follows this very narrow bound down to lower poverty.
Right.
You can have a vision of lower poverty, but that vision of lower poverty
is higher consumption.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
The idea that you're going to move in this graph outside of the range of significantly outside of the range of the combinations of consumption and poverty ever observed is likely to be a fantasy, not a vision.
One nice way I've heard you say this in the past is there's no country that achieves high basic standard of living at low income,
Right.
and there is no country with high income that has low standard of
Right.
living.
And it also, because people, people have a hard time accepting that, growth is necessary and sufficient. Because all the time, the organization JPAL, which supposedly stands for evidence-based thinking, had this thing where they said growth is not enough. Yeah. And it was just no evidence of that, because what they were really saying, often when people say growth is not enough, what they mean is there are cost-effective ways to address poverty. And I was like, I'm not disputing that. But cost-effective still doesn't mean you can produce huge reductions in poverty. You can do better with the resources you're devoting to poverty reduction. Everybody should be in favor of being as effective as we can possibly be. But they say growth is not enough. And if you look at this data development graph, you're claiming that if I move, the distribution of consumption among households out this way, I'm not going to, and there's no country example of that. It's just false.
To say
and yet they say it.
To say it another way is like, when they say growth is not enough, is that if you're at a certain level, you could do slightly better on malnutrition, slightly better on poverty, but you cannot do dramatically better.
And
one very nice.
And again, this is, like I say, this is, I'm trying to be as look, I am as for being as effective and as efficient as possible in lowering malnutrition as anybody. And so the effective altruists, for instance, one of their interventions they claim has super high, lives saved per dollar is vitamin A supplementation.
Okay.
Great. Nobody could, I feel nobody should possibly construe my enthusiasm for economic growth as being anti-vitamin A supplementation. They're just, it's not a trade-off, right? But on the other hand, if you think, how well can I produce not an entire array of basics, not just vitamin A, malnutrition, but caloric sufficiency, adequate protein, adequate diet in a whole variety of ways, better learning outcomes,
life prosperity,
better health care, access to infrastructure like electricity that makes your life enormously easier, access to water. It starts to be, economic growth contributes to all of those things, some of which are programmatically manipulable and some of which just, even if you do them efficiently, they're still just very costly and you just can't afford it. I mean, the government of Ethiopia devotes about $300 per capita to all uses, right? So everything the government of Ethiopia has to do has to be done within an envelope of $300 per capita. And that's government spending, not include transfers, which end up in consumption, but okay. It's like, look, and then at the same time people look and think, well, why doesn't Ethiopia have the standard of living of Denmark? Well, Denmark, has GDP of 35,000, of which 40% is
government spending.
20%. So well, if we take G as opposed to a lot of it's transfers, but 20%, that's like 10 times as big or 50 times as big.
Yeah.
And you just can't expect, however efficient and effective the government
have $20,000.
I mean, I sometimes say, look, if
you got it from heaven.
If the God in heaven descended, whatever God or whatever heaven you might believe in descended and was faced with spending $300 to solve all of Ethiopia's problems, they couldn't do it.
Right.
No matter how well-meaning, no matter how beneficent, no matter how.
And one example I've seen in your work
I think
that I find really interesting, and it's on our reading list for onboarding people, is that blog that you have, development work versus charity.
Yeah.
Right? Like so.
Yeah.
And that's where you show that, like, look.
Yeah.
Charity programs, the impact is this much, and growth delivers this much.
Yeah, and again, saying that, I use in a blog post that contrasts development work and charity work, this intervention in Niger that, was cost effective because they did a psychosocial component of a cash transfer that raised people's incomes, and it was super cheap. I'm like, terrific, but the consumption went from, and these numbers might be slightly off, and they're in the blog, but it's like it went from $1.78 to $1.87 a day, whereas Vietnam went from $1.87 in 1991 to $8 of consumption. That's development. And so the upside of cost-effective poverty interventions just doesn't, it's just massively different,
so
right?
Growth is just, and like you said, and I've now taken to saying it's the only thing that matters, like you said. Right?
Yeah.
It's not that it does matter.
Yeah, the debate of whether it does matter just isn't the debate. The debate
unfortunately, for
many
people,
no.
It shouldn't be the debate.
It shouldn't be the debate because the question isn't, is there an association between GDP per capita and child mortality? It's once you properly account for GDP per capita, how much else is left to be explained? And with poverty, the answer is essentially nothing. Like if you look at the data and development curves that I've developed around poverty, it's like, if you tell me a country's median consumption, I can tell you its poverty rate to within, relative to the 0 to 1 kind of range, 0 to 100% poverty, I can tell you within a percentage point or two what your poverty is, just based, not knowing anything about your anti-poverty stance, not knowing anything about your anti-poverty programs, not knowing anything about the ideology of your government, not knowing anything. Just median consumption tells you what poverty is.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So growth is incredibly important. I'm glad we established that.
Yeah.
Now the other point, right, which again I've come across first in your writings, is that growth is also incredibly difficult. Right. It's very rare. It's easily reversed. And again, this is something that I've come across in your papers first. And so I want you to talk a little bit about that, because I think too many people think like, okay, growth is important, but growth is happening. Right. Why should we care about it?
Yeah. So, and I think people just, the quickest growth to low or stagnant growth or a crisis is complacency during high growth. And I think people just tend to assume that there's this kind of inertia to growth rates that just isn't true in the data. So, and let's be clear, I part of what I've been behind and it's kind of been widely adopted is to think of growth not as like a steady thing, but as episodes. So you have an episode of high growth and then maybe an episode of stagnation. And what's hard to do is maintain very high growth rates for very extended periods. It's
not just hard, right? It's almost impossible.
It's almost impossible. And we'll get to that in a second. But and so if you look at the data, actually bursts of growth are relatively easy to generate. So, we did research where we said how many episodes did we have where growth sharply accelerated from when we had a criteria for what a sharp acceleration in the growth rate was, and we actually found lots of episodes of sharp accelerations in growth where the episode had to last at least 8 years. So this isn't cyclical fluctuations in the standard business cycle sense. This is, and by our standard, an episode of 8 years of growth was going to leave your GDP per capita 50% higher than it was. So it was a big deal, right? So generating bursts of growth, again, where an episode to count as an episode of growth as opposed to just a cyclical recovery had to beat certain criteria. Episodes of high growth are actually pretty common. What's uncommon is that you stay in an episode of high growth for very long periods. So, what people often don't realize is when they hear the list of high growth countries, it's the total list. People say, why don't you have high growth like South Korea and Taiwan? And it's like, well, if you list all of the episodes of really countries having, GDP growth that was, say, more than 5% per capita for longer than 30 years, you don't hear examples of the list. You hear the whole list.
I try to make the point that as far as by my counting, Only 5 countries have made it from low income to high income through sustained growth in the last 70 years. And
Yeah, yeah.
2 of those are cities and not countries.
Exactly. No, exactly. That's and when they did, the World Bank was a sponsor of a big growth study headed by Michael Spence. So they said, well, let's look at the characteristics of high growth countries, and they identified high growth countries with some criteria of the length and magnitude of the growth episode, and there were only 13 countries, and that was being generous on the margin. Five is probably and so when people say and then they list 5 countries, you might assume they listed 5 of 50 or 5 of 30 or 5 of 12. No, it's those 5.
That's all of it. Right.
Why? It's like, why can't you be fast like Usain Bolt? It's like, well, Usain Bolt's the fastest human being there ever was.
And there's no other.
So we can't list, why can't you run the 100-yard dash? I mean, and I do think countries, fall prey to this. It's like, well, why can't you run the 100-yard dash in under 9.9 seconds? Well, it's like, well, wait a second, only and I don't really know what the answer to this is, but they choose some threshold that basically only 3 people in the world can attain, and then I'm not going to attain that. You're not going to attain that. So we can run faster, but we can't run. We can't achieve that. So sustaining high growth is a very hard thing, and I think people get complacent. They tend to extrapolate good news into the future and discount bad news. So they, all the time, there are all kinds of pressures that build up during a boom that can bring it to an end. And so, like I say, complacency during low growth.
You started with Argentina, and Argentina is like the poster child.
Yeah. Argentina has bursts of growth, but then often the burst of growth has within it the seeds of the subsequent stagnation or collapse. And so, what characterizes the developing world versus the developed world is not that they differ in average growth, they differ in the magnitude of the episodes. So when poor countries are growing, they tend to grow faster than the rich countries,
of course,
which is 2% per capita. But when they collapse by a lot more. So, I have the example of Ghana and the United Kingdom over the 50 years had exactly the same growth rate, 2% per capita. In the UK, it was roughly 2% per capita every year. In Ghana, it was a burst of 8% growth, followed by a huge collapse, followed by another burst. And so Ghana is so you could say Ghana grew at 2%, but you'd miss all of the real action, right? It was going. So which leads me to, I think the analytically right way to think about growth is, how do I initiate an episode of rapid growth? And then how do I sustain an episode of rapid growth for as long as possible?
Right.
And the initiate and sustain is very difficult. Whereas, people tend to think it's almost like, Aristotelian versus Newtonian physics. It's like, do you assume that an object in motion just remains in motion, or do you assume that the object slows down, right? Turns out the Aristotelian view that objects slow down is the right view about growth.
I mean,
growth tends to...
The Newtonian view is also right because there are forces acting against it.
Yeah, but there are forces, exactly.
Forces.
I mean, Aristotelian is right about the world as we see it because the world we see it has friction in it.
Yes. Exactly.
And, in the Newtonian world, if we assume away friction, things would continue forever. But, when do we assume away friction? So reversion to the mean is one way of describing this, is if you're experiencing a period of high growth, your expectation for the future shouldn't be future high growth. It should be that your growth is going to slow. And journalists get this wrong. The IMF gets this wrong. The
governments
World Bank,
get it wrong.
Governments get it wrong. If you look at, IMF projections of growth rates, they don't build in enough. They build in some reversion to the mean, but not nearly as enough as the data actually has.
So hopefully now we've convinced everybody that growth is important and that we should focus on it.
Yes.
What do we do about it? Like, how do countries grow? What's the...
I think, I think what we do about it is be continually engaged in a process that we call a growth diagnostic. And what we mean by growth diagnostic is not a list of things that are good for growth, but what right now, what in the current conditions would be the most likely to help us either accelerate or sustain ourselves in high growth. So you have to look at what the pressures are in the economy and what are becoming the binding constraints to further growth, right, and then address those in advance.
Right.
And this is, and we've developed a set of diagnostic criteria and indicators, like how would I, sometimes when I teach students, I say, let's make a list of things that are good for growth. And when we hit about, and I write them on the chalkboard, and when we hit about 25 things, it starts to dawn on the students what I'm doing. They go, oh my gosh, we can't do all those things. But everything they name, is good for growth in the sense that you would probably as a country have somewhat higher income if you had it versus not had it.
Right.
And in some times and spaces, it's likely to be super important. But, if you make a list like this, you realize we'll have to prioritize.
Right.
No government, no society, no private sector can cope with all those things at once. And the growth diagnostic, therefore, is a prioritization. And so I think what we need to do about growth is we need to have a concrete analytical way of deciding what's likely to end our growth episode if we're in a high growth episode, and how do we avoid that? So, all kinds of high growth episodes end because of irrational exuberance. You see real estate prices are growing. Oh my gosh, real estate prices are growing. There's sort of a roller coaster effect. It's like, wow, real estate prices are growing. I got to get into this market. I got to invest. And then all of a sudden, you've been on a roller coaster. It's like, I can see that, whoosh. So irrational exuberance that affects financial markets and creates the conditions of a financial crisis is one way. The same thing on the public sector side of sort of fiscal exuberance, right, of, oh my gosh, look, we have, a bounty in our fiscal, let's spend it now. And then you can easily end up, building up obligations that don't immediately disappear when the economy slows.
Right.
Failure to let me just say one more thing, because I think this is super important.
Please.
Another thing that ends high growth episodes is people don't realize that typically if you're having a high growth episode in exports, it's that you're moving through an S curve.
Right.
You discover something that your country is capable of doing, you start moving up the S curve, and that item is growing at 30% a year. And the way you sustain, say, 10% export growth is you move into a sequence of S curves. So, and the problem is you often get so fixated on the high growth of the industry you're rapidly growing in, you forget that your real challenge is discovering the next three in the sequence, right? So you can get into ready-made garments, and like, wow, look, ready-made garments, where our growth is going so fast, and we need to make sure we're sustaining the ready-made garment industry and doing everything we can to keep them growing. But there's a natural, you can't grow at 30% a year because first of all, it's a larger base, and second of all, you're penetrating markets and And if you haven't looked ahead to what's the next thing, right, then all of a sudden growth start to taper off, So that's the third thing, is failure to be planning
ahead,
not just supporting existing success, but planning for the next round of success. Anyway, so what I'm trying to illustrate is not these three things, but if I'm in an episode of high growth, I want to be doing the growth diagnostic of what's likely to bring this episode to an unhappy end, and making sure I'm avoiding it, right?
So that approach is very open-ended, right? But
yes,
like everything you've said seems to be hinting at there are broader principles underpinning it that are obviously very familiar to you, but may not be to a more general person, right? And let me try and give you a sense of what I'm saying, and then you can tell me how right or wrong I am, right? So what we often say is that for a poor country, exports is exceedingly important, right? Because you're connecting to a high productivity value chain, right? Like it just helps people gain skills. So exports, just as an area of focus, becomes very important. Then instead of focusing purely on sectors, you have to focus on, okay, look, what makes people more competitive, businesses more competitive, etc. So stuff like that. Are there sort of things that you would encourage people to try and think about if they're doing a growth diagnostic?
Yeah, so I want to be clear. The growth diagnostic includes a whole array of things like macro conditions, infrastructure conditions. But then if you start looking at exports, I think Ricardo Hausmann, the work that he's done with others on the complexity of your exports is a really fundamentally important insight. Because his insight is what rich countries do. People had the Ricardian, David Ricardo notion that countries specialize, but rich countries in fact don't specialize. They actually export pretty much everything, right? Meaning,
I could disagree, right?
You could, but you...
No rich country exports garments, for instance, right? Like they could, but they don't.
They do, actually.
Italy, to some extent.
Now, and again, this is why this gets more complicated than I meant it to get. But so let's back off for a second. Sure. I'm saying the main thing rich countries do, right, is they export products that are complex. And what we mean by complex is it requires a lot of capabilities to come together to make that happen.
Sure.
So I do think an important part of a growth diagnostic for a country that sees exports as critical, which I think is almost always right, is am I moving my country into domains of the product space that I can acquire the capabilities to do and are dense. So I want to think, what can I do? The key question for countries is, what can I embed my domestically available factors in and sell it to the rest of the world? And how do I keep moving up? And again, it used to be called the value chain. I think the value chain was, they used to have ideas of export quality ladders, and I don't think the export quality ladder is as sophisticated as the new complexity analysis. Because what you want to say is, and this is, again, Hausmann's work, not mine, I want to be examining the adjacent possible.
Sure.
If I'm exporting this, what's nearby in an economically relevant sense that I can also do?
Right.
And what are the capabilities I lack to do that? And a diagnostic can help you with that.
Let me be presumptuous and add a dimension to that.
Okay.
For India in particular, is what can I do at scale? Because India is this funny, we have revealed comparative advantage in a whole range of industries, including very complex ones. We export many different things, but it's one company doing the export. It's tiny in scale, right? So, and that's, at scale, you have to be doing that in a way that is competitive at the ecosystem level.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's hugely important. And implicitly, so if you look at, again, a product space map, it has both what's nearby and what's large.
Yes.
Right? And so you want to be moving into, products that are the adjacent possible and have the potential for scale, because you don't want to move into, small things. And I do think India is very different than most other countries in the sense that you're exactly right. If you look at India on Hausmann's measures, it has enormously complex exports relative to its GDP. Now, in some ways, that's good news, because in Hausmann's model, that predicts future high growth for India as they expand. But it also might be a little worrisome that this apparent complexity is happening because we're doing a tiny little bit of export of that and a tiny little bit of export of that, and we have one firm that's embedded with some pharmaceutical doing one bit of that, and expanding the array of firms within the economy that can also expand into that market is a concern. So it's, ready-made garments, and I'm using ready-made garments because your neighbor next door, Bangladesh, has obviously ridden ready-made garments up, but by the way, appears to have ridden it to its
unhappy conclusion, but
it's unhappy.
The story is not over, I guess. Yeah.
No, I mean, the story is not over, but it's sort of like, it's a classic story.
Yes,
I mean, I'm using it because it's a classic story. Is we discover a new industry, a few firms can do it, the ability, there's lots of case studies written already of the Bangladesh ready-made garment industry. It expand, those capabilities expand in the ways that Alfred Marshall described as being in the air in an industry town, and therefore they get on this growth trajectory. And it's easy right here in the steepest part of the S to think, whoa, Bangladesh miracle, we're done. And it's like, no. I mean, it's going to hit a limit. The world isn't infinitely elastic with respect to absorbing Bangladesh ready-made garments.
Right.
And, you can pay so much attention to, feeding the needs of that one industry, you fail to develop others. Whereas India kind of has the opposite problem, is it has lots of, I'm just making up a metaphor on the spot, but, they use the metaphor of unicorns as, relatively large new firms.
Yes.
It has lots of Shetland ponies. It has lots of firms that are doing amazing things, relative, super high capability things, but in a smallish way relative to either the size of India and India's export needs or the world. So,
no, that's absolutely true. And I guess the general thing to get to is that you need to use success in any one area at scale to prepare the ground for other people to succeed at scale also.
Exactly. And this is, this is really hard because the natural propensity and the understandable propensity of firms is they want to be the success, and they don't necessarily, no firm is really that interested in creating the preconditions for other firms to enter their industry, even though it's often not zero sum. I mean, the world market is a huge thing. So, and so I think I think a key question is, how do we create a dynamic in which the government is listening to and supporting, emerging industries in a way that focuses on productivity and not profitability?
That's really hard for even me to imagine. Like, how would you identify productivity without thinking of profitability?
I just hope everybody understood what I'm saying, because the natural instinct of a firm is, if I'm going to ask the government something, I prefer to ask it for something that enhances my profitability, like a tax break, and not my productivity, like better infrastructure.
I get it.
Right? And so what you want is industries, if you think, what's the acceptable ask of an industry, right? The difficulty is in a weakly institutionalized environment in politics, the acceptable ask is just give me a unique monopoly over this industry, or
give me money,
or just give me money, like give me a subsidy, right? Give me, or tax breaks are the equivalent of giving us money, and therefore you create a negative dynamic, because a successful firm that becomes successful by having asked the government favors that enhance its profitability and not its productivity.
It's at the expense of others, right?
It's at the expense of
It's not
others.
public good. It's like
exactly.
You give to one, you take from another.
Exactly. Whereas if you create a dynamic, again, what you want to think is, we want to create where the government's listening to the needs of industry, but where the only acceptable ask is enhancing productivity. And if you focus on the acceptable ask is, we need, better infrastructure. Well, that's something that's going to have umbrella-like effects. If I open the umbrella for you, other people get shaved.
So you have this really nice framework where you talk about firms that focus on exports versus the one. So I really like that. Could you talk me through it, please?
No, we kind of distinguish between we distinguish between people that are export-oriented and people that are domestic market and industries that are competitive and industries that tend to be restricted. And so a key distinction becomes between what we call power brokers, who are people that use their power both economically and politically to create profitability for themselves, mostly in non-tradable industries.
Right.
So I was just talking to a colleague of mine that's studying governments and what governments are doing, and governments are often involved in the hotel industry.
Right.
It's like, of all the industries that you might think, is really a high productivity use of government resource, hotels is not one of them.
Right.
But it's an industry that often crowds in power brokers. Because if I'm going to build a luxury hotel that's going to attract high clientele, I need a lot of cooperation.
Right.
And so powerful people are often doing non-tradable things that aren't dynamic,
Right.
aren't, expanding the frontier of the economy, and are often doing it in ways that impose costs on the rest of the economy.
Right.
So in the competitive domestic sector, we call them workhorses. People who are trying to just make a living and don't have power, they often have to pay the costs of high infrastructure because the infrastructure industry is dominated by power brokers, or they have to pay the, costs of,
So if you're a competitive firm in a domestic, you're a workhorse.
Right, you're a workhorse,
Yeah.
right?
And if
And
you're a
again, the
powerful
informal sector, no
SMEs,
part
small,
of India's challenge is that people don't work hard,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I have never, when I very first came to India, it struck me as like, this is an unbelievably dynamic, hard-working place. Like, no one accuses the informal sector people of not working hard enough, right? So now, in this matrix, the people that are trying to do exports and then there's exports that are natural resource that are rents. So there's rentiers, and then
So
we
the
label
the coal exporters or the oil exporters.
Right. And we label the box of competitive exporters magicians, because this is really hard, right? Because you can't pass the costs. You can't, what power brokers do is they pass the costs of their own profitability or inefficiency on to other consumers because it's
taxpayers.
On to the workhorses or on to the economy. Whereas exports, you can't force foreign buyers to absorb costs.
So, and in India, these magicians, and I love that term, right? It's the Infosys and the TCS, right? Like they're big export-oriented firms.
And India has produced a number of just spectacular magicians, but it's, we named them that. This is work I did with a colleague, Eric Worker, which is a great name for an economist. I've written papers with an economist named David Dollar. What a great name for an economist, and Eric Worker. Anyway, Eric Worker, it's sad that we have to call them magicians, but we call them magicians because, they can go to their government and ask for support, but the support can't be the easy kind. I can't give you a monopoly in the export market. I can't give you tax break. I could give you tax breaks, but again, you have to sell in a competitive market.
Right.
And so, focusing on the needs of the magicians is often a way to regulate the acceptable ask. Right? You can ask us, and if you look at the example of Korea, a huge debate about how much of Korea was laissez-faire versus industrial policy. But the difference with Korea and other countries wasn't that, Nigeria had industrial policy too. It wasn't that, Korea had industrial policy and Nigeria didn't. It's that Korea somehow managed to create an industrial policy that actually was effective. One of the ways they did it is they, limited the acceptable ask. We're demanding that in order for you to be in our favor as government and get the support we're going to give you, you have to be able to export successfully. And therefore, what you need to ask us are things that help you export successfully.
Right.
And then, if you say, and if you come to the government and go, look, to get into shipbuilding, we just need way more, really highly quality welders than we're generating. We need you to help us, facilitate the creation of training and certification of welders. Government can be like, yeah, that's a productivity enhancing thing,
Yeah.
but has an umbrella, because welders aren't just going to work in shipbuilding, they're going to work in other industries that require metal fabrication. So this is the way you can get a positive dynamic from the feedback loop from government to industry rather than a negative dynamic.
Right. Focus on
Focus
more broadly applicable things that especially that are export oriented.
And the challenge, is getting the challenge is getting magicians who don't yet exist supported, right? Because it's like you say, it's easy to become, once an industry takes off, it's
you
easy
can take care of yourself.
You can really take care of it. But again, looking forward and saying, what's the adjacent possible? What else, our exports in this sector are going to grow and then decline. What other industry sectors, products can we be in? And how do we identify those people that, and again, this is, sounds like, this is in some sense activist, but it has to be limited activism, because the danger of government intervention is if it's unconstrained. If the government, comes to a private sector firm and says, what can we do for you? The answer is going to be a terrible thing. I mean, Adam Smith, has a phrase like, seldom do, members of the same industry get together.
Except to plot against the general public.
Plot against the general public.
Yeah.
So, this is not saying, government should listen more to the private sector.
Right.
Because after all, the private sector already has a pretty loud voice. The private sector's natural tendency is going to be asked for things that are profitability enhancing, whether they're productivity enhancing or not. So
focus
a
on
lot of the key thing is, how do we focus on creating mechanisms of identifying and augmenting the voices of people that are asking for things that will enhance the general productive capability of the economy in a way that makes their industry now possible and opens an umbrella that gives shade and augments other industries. And then you can...
I prefer they should focus on creating magic.
Well, creating magic.
Yeah.
But of course, the essence of magic is stuffing the rabbit into the hat before the show starts, right? So again, this analogy might actually be pretty good, which is, look, the magic is actually getting ahead of the game. The magic is getting a government and industry who sees, look, what we need to do next is this, and the preconditions of this that would enhance the productivity of that industry that require public sector action are the following things, and let's facilitate that.
Right. We'll wrap up very quickly. I want to touch on a topic that, again, as with many other topics you've really brought to the front, is the idea of labor mobility.
Okay.
Is that, look, so why don't you cover it?
Well, and let's just start with labor mobility. You notice I'm not using the word migration.
Yes. I
think migration just carries so many connotations that are, negative to so many people. What I want to talk about is the main determinant of a person's productivity is their place. One of the things, I have to admit, a huge fraction of my income is that I was born in America. Like, I come to India equally smart, equally hardworking, equally capability, just don't make the same money I make because they're not embedded in a productive place. Whereas I had the good fortune of being born in a productive place. So productivity is partly about people, but it's also about places. And there's a place premium. If you drive a taxi, same amount of work, you're just going to make a lot more money if you're in a dense market than if you're in a poor market.
New York versus Delhi.
And so productivity of the person can be exactly the same, but their productivity enhances by being in a productive place. So
because they're trading with richer people.
Right.
They're trading with people whose productivity.
Right. You're trading with people who can pay you higher value for moving from here to there.
Yeah.
So we've known that for a long time. And the obstacle to labor mobility is always the rich countries. They just don't want it. Okay. I think that's going to change dramatically in the next 5 to 10 years because reality is going to change. There's something called the demographic pyramid as we array people from young to old and how many people are in these various categories. And in a growing economy, there's more young than there are middle-aged than there are old because it's growing.
So it's a pyramid.
So you have a pyramid, and we call it the demographic pyramid. Well, now many rich countries are inverting, so it's no longer a demographic pyramid, it's a demographic space needle or something.
You can call it a demographic diamond.
Yeah, it's a diamond. So due to the dramatic fertility falls in nearly all of the rich industrial world, they are already in and headed to a worse and worse shortage of labor. They just aren't going to have enough workers. So, I've just recently completed some research where I say, if Spain has zero migration from now to 2050, what's the ratio of people over 65 to workers? Right. And it's headed to 1 to 1. Wow. You can't run a modern economy, and particularly you can't run a modern social protection
aging economy.
And again, that's one worker for every person over 65. And by the way this pyramid is working, even among people over 65, there's going to be more people, of the people over 65, more of the over 65 are going to be over 80.
Right.
So you can't solve this with like extending retirement ages and something. The only solution to this is for Spain to take advantage of the fact that it's a high productivity economy and invite more people to work in its economy. And I think what's going to happen is countries are going to realize they have to answer 3 different questions, whereas now they only answer 2. Now they answer the question, who's the future of Spain as a political, as a social, as a vision of what Spain is? And that's a pathway to citizenship, migration. That's what we think of as migration. The second is, who are the movers of distress? How many of the world's refugees or otherwise persecuted people is Spain going to admit? And those are the 2 questions. Those 2 questions do not add up to the total number of people that they're going to need.
Right.
And so they need to have a third question is, who are we going to allow to live and work in Spain on a temporary contractual basis where we expect there to be legal pathways to work, but then those involve specified contractual return. And so that's what I mean by labor mobility. I don't mean permanent migration, that everyone from India or everyone from Senegal is going to move permanently to Germany or France.
And become citizens.
Exactly. On a pathway, and again, there can be pathways to citizenship via labor mobility, meaning a country could structure a program so you can come for 3 years, you have to go back for a year, you can come for another 3 years, and each time you successfully come and go, you accumulate a points towards a long-term visa if you want it. But lots of people want to work in rich countries, but they don't want to stay there forever. I mean, lots of Indians have moved to America and moved back. So I think a mechanism for labor mobility can generate, this recent paper, I calculate the potential gains by 2050 if the rich countries fill out their needed labor with labor mobility from poor countries. It would add $6 trillion to the world economy. Right. An economy the size of Japan could just be created by allowing workers to move from low productivity places to high productivity places temporarily. And again, that's just the temporary part. And again, it's hard to, when you advocate one thing, to have people hear you advocating against another. I am not against all these countries being open to immigration. I'm saying they have to do both.
It's a separate mechanism.
The total need of the rich industrial world for workers by 2050 is 400 million people. Yeah. And there's just no way the current politics look like the body politic as it's currently constituted is going to allow 400 million people to become citizens. Yeah. I mean, because if they do, they in many rich industrial countries, if you filled out your labor market demographic pyramid with, pathway to citizenship, the foreign-born would be half of the voting population. And clearly existing voters just aren't in the mood for that.
And in India, it's very easy for us to picture something like this because Kerala already sends people on temporary.
Yeah, in India,
huge numbers.
There's a great book by Chinmay about India moving. India has a long history of migration of all types, rotational, permanent. When I was living in London, nearby there was an Indian restaurant from Kenya. Yeah. because, Gujaratis had moved to Kenya.
Yes.
The Kenyans had developed, the Gujarati food had become popular in Kenya. There was an Indian chain that then opened a branch in London. I thought, this is true globalization when I'm eating Indian.
And from a long time
I'm
ago.
eating Kenyan, a Kenyan brand of Indian food.
Yeah.
Anyway, but so India has had long experience with mobility. States like Kerala, have clearly, been much more prosperous than if they had limited themselves to just working in Kerala.
Yeah.
I think India can be a global leader in this, in the sense that in order for this to happen at scale, we need to create an industry of people who move people.
Yeah.
There needs to be cooperation between sending countries and host countries about how people will move, how they'll be recruited, how they'll be prepared so that they can show up
Right.
in countries with the skills they need and certification of the skills they need, so employers can rely on that supply chain. They need to be placed. We need to decide how open is the labor market. It can't be that we send you to Germany to work in aged care because we have a shortage in aged care and you go work
Yeah.
in something else, but neither do we want to tie you to a single employer, so there's complex issues of placement. These people need to be protected. India's experience with the Gulf, they're really, particularly in industries like domestic care,
There are bad things
there's
that happen
really,
occasionally.
and it's
Small
difficult, to protect somebody who's not a citizen.
Yeah.
And then they need to be reliably returned, because the political deal has to be, you can come, but, we are protecting the sense of the future of us. We're not going to decide the future of us based on our current labor market needs.
Right.
And it's a perfectly, it's not xenophobic or racist to think that being Spanish is a unique and important thing in the world, and we have a sense of what being Spanish means, and we're going to preserve that Spanishness.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, we're going to be open to have people living in Spain. I see that as a acceptable array of views, and it's not, it's not intrinsically racist or xenophobic to
Yeah.
believe there's something special about your culture and your history. And so I think the temporary labor mobility opens a political pathway
Yeah.
in which you can reassure you don't have to lose control of the destiny of the future of us in order to have the workers you need.
But to go back to what you were saying,
Yeah.
you're saying that there are industrial arrangements and institutional arrangements that we
Yeah.
need to come up with,
Yeah.
and India can potentially be a leader in coming up with these.
Oh,
and
absolutely,
showing the way.
absolutely. Because I think India is just well placed to be a leader in that. I think India, in some ways rightly, in many ways rightly, has not been particularly supportive of supporting global public goods. It's like, look, we should benefit from global public goods, and countries like America and Europe should bear the costs. And that, about the trading system, about lots of things, that is an absolutely legitimate stance for India to take.
Yeah.
But I think in this domain, India could be the provider of an important global public good, with being the representative of the South in creating South-friendly mechanisms of the labor mobility that the rich countries need.
Yeah. Thank you, Lant. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for talking to us.
It's always fun.